This past year, I stayed in a cabin that my family has had for generations. It's a small two-bedroom cabin that's basically in the middle of nowhere, but the whole family uses it as a vacation home or for a weekend getaway or anything like that. I'd never been too interested in staying there because it only had well water with a manual pump, and the only bathroom was an outhouse that was across the yard. The only reason I stayed there for this first time was because I wanted to go somewhere to get away from everything for a couple of days. But I didn't have any money to rent my own cabin. When I got there, I was really surprised by how remote it was. I knew it was going to be far out, but this cabin felt like it was off the grid. I parked my car on the side and started the generator for electricity, then used the family key to get in. It wasn't bad at all, and for it being free, I really couldn't complain. I got everything set up the way I wanted and made sure nothing was wrong with the place. Then made myself some tea and sat by the fireplace with my laptop. There was no service way out here, but I had some relaxing things I could work on without the internet. I really didn't keep track of time, but a few hours past sundown, I put everything away and was ready to hit the sack. I went outside to turn off the generator so that I wouldn't waste the fuel, but out in the woods there was a light. It was very noticeable, literally being the only visible light within miles of the cabin. I watched it move through the woods until it slowly disappeared far away. I stayed outside for another few minutes to make sure it was actually gone, then went back inside. Being in such a remote cabin far from any sort of civilization made it really unnerving to see that someone happened to be so close by. I put out the fireplace and used a battery-powered lamp to get to the bedroom, then got in bed and fell asleep. In the morning, I got up at sunrise and made coffee and stayed inside the cabin until midday, then went out to take a walk around. I really wanted to see what was up with that light I'd seen, so I set out towards where I saw the light from last night. It took me around 20 minutes to get where I thought it was, but there didn't look like there was any walking path anywhere, and I didn't see any signs of anyone being here. After looking around, I went back to the cabin and went on with my day. I got the fireplace going again and did all the same stuff I did yesterday. When I was ready for bed, I went out to the generator and, again, I saw that light. It was in the same spot that I'd seen it the night before, but this time it wasn't moving. It was staying still, glowing, far off in the woods. I watched it for a minute, but it never moved or even flickered, so I went inside and within the hour, I was in bed sleeping. Sometime through the night, though, I woke up. I was groggy and tired, but really had to use the bathroom. I stayed in bed for as long as I could, hoping the feeling would go away, but I just couldn't wait any longer. I threw on some clothes and some shoes, then grabbed the handheld lamp and went outside to the outhouse. I did my business, but on the walk back through the yard, I found footprints standing right in front of one of the windows. I looked closely, and I was sure they were not mine. Then I saw the line of steps they took. They went all the way around the cabin until they veered off. I wasn't going to follow them away from the cabin, but when I looked up in the direction they were leading, it perfectly met up with where I had seen the lights out in the woods earlier, but now the light was gone. My stomach sank, and I ran for the cabin. Then I got my bag and drove away in the dark, not even looking back. I'll probably never know exactly what happened that night at the cabin, but I'm not sure if I even want to know. I was on a hike during a vacation I was taking last summer. One of my other plans was canceled for that day, so the hike was a last-minute decision. The place I was at wasn't known for having that great of a nature scene or anything. It was mostly flat, with woods all around, but I was just out there because I had nothing better to do. I found it to be a little odd how along this trail I kept seeing more paths branching off from the main one. They all looked small and thin, like they had just been made by a few people trying to take a shortcut, but one of these paths caught my attention. It went straight off in a different direction than the main trail, and just from the way everything around it looked, I couldn't see any reason someone would go off that way. I tried to look around as far as I could, but the woods were pretty dense and the trees blocked my view. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to go down it just to see where it went. I was thinking it probably led to a pond or some other mildly cool place, but really anything was better than the trail I was on before. I walked for about 15 minutes, which was much further than I was expecting, until I got to the end. It faded out into nothing but grass and trees. I continued walking past the end just a few steps, and that's when I saw something not too far away. A cabin sitting right in the middle of the woods. The wood had moss covering it, and the ceiling looked like it was about to cave in at any second. I went up to the front of it and saw that the door was missing, yet the trees blocked out most of the sunlight, making the inside hard to see. I took a few more steps closer until I was standing in the doorway. It was still really dark, but I could make out some debris scattered around the floor, like destroyed tables and pieces of wood. I held up my phone to provide me with some sort of light source, then walked further inside. There were 2 rooms, both mostly empty aside from the debris, but there was one door in the middle of the hallway that was half open. I looked in and saw a staircase leading down 10 or 15 steps into a basement. It was obviously really creepy and something straight out of a horror movie, but seeing as the entire cabin was empty and very clearly abandoned, I didn't see any actual danger to it. I walked down to the bottom and was immediately hit with an odor. It smelled like it was infested with rats. I held my phone up toward the opening of the room and found that it was extremely small, like a small walk-in closet made of decaying wood. But on the wall was another partially open door. My phone light barely reached the tiny opening, but I could see that it was some kind of long tunnel. I was too scared to go any closer, so I just stood at the steps and looked. From where I was, I could only see into the first few feet of the tunnel, but it was not well made and was crumbling in some parts, and everything past that was completely engulfed in darkness. The fear was slowly building in me, and it was then that I decided I'd had enough. I turned around to go back up the steps, but as my phone passed over the room, a figure's eyes lit up in the light, standing in the corner of the room under the stairs. I frantically sprinted up, tripping over the steps as my fear immediately took over me. I ran straight out of the cabin and all the way back to the main trail, not stopping until I was back in my car and driving out of the woods. I'm not sure who it was that I saw or what they were doing there, but the image of their eyes lighting up just a couple feet from me in that dark basement still gives me nightmares. I was staying at an Airbnb for a single night on a road trip I was taking last year. The place was a cabin-style home in a forest that was the halfway point along my road trip, so I was only staying there for a night, then heading back out to finish the drive. When I arrived, it was just before sunset. I drove down a rather long gravel road for a few minutes until I reached the cabin. It looked older than I was expecting, and the walk from the driveway up to the front door was a small dirt path that had been turned to mud from a recent rainfall. When I finally managed to haul my bags inside, I took a look around. There were very few windows, so even with the sun partially up, it was still really dark inside. I turned on one of the lights in the corner of the room, but that was the only light in the entire cabin that worked. I sent a text to the host asking if I was missing a power switch or something, but already I was unhappy with this stay, though it was just for a night, so I tried not to stress over it too much. I put all of my things in the bedroom, then went out to one of the sofa chairs in the living space. While it was really old and outdated with the decor, it was still cozy. I took my phone out and started planning out the second half of my drive tomorrow, when a sudden knock came from the front door. They knocked so loudly, I was actually more angry than I was confused about who was there. There was no people or anything to look out of, so I just opened the door. A man was on the porch in heavy winter clothing and had a big smile on his face. It was a bit breezy outside, but it definitely wasn't necessary to be wearing a snow jacket. Anyway, he said he was the host and was here to help me with the lights. I wasn't really happy about him coming down without telling me, and honestly I didn't care that much about the lights, but since he was already here, I agreed to let him help. He walked right into the living space and up to one of the lamps and started tinkering with it. While he did that, I looked out into the driveway, and strangely I didn't see any other cars. This place was so far out in the middle of nowhere, he had to have driven to have gotten here so quickly after I sent the text. I turned back around to ask the host about it, but he was already looking at me from across the room. There was an awkward moment of us looking at each other before the man smiled and apologized, saying he couldn't figure it out. I said not to worry about it, that I had to get to bed soon anyways, then stepped aside to let him out. He slowly left the cabin and walked away without saying anything else. The whole thing was weird, and I was very interested in how he possibly could have gotten here without a car, so I watched him. He walked pretty far down the gravel driveway and looked like he was just going to keep walking, but then he stopped and turned around. I watched, hoping he couldn't see me, as the man stared at the cabin and just stood there. Then he walked off the gravel to the side until he was in the forest. I wasn't sure what to think about everything that just happened, but seeing the host dressed like he was living outside and then watching him walk into the forest gave me a really bad feeling. I stayed up for another 20 minutes on my phone, checking the windows every so often, and just before I was going to get ready for bed, there was a loud knock at my door again. I was sure it had to be the host, but it was too dark for anyone to be showing up. They knocked again with the same aggressiveness. I really didn't know what to do, so I just stayed quiet. After a minute, I heard him walk around to the side of the cabin. I cautiously walked into the bedroom and shined my phone light so I could see. I listened to their footsteps until they got right next to the window, where they stopped. There was a moment of silence as I shined my light at the window, waiting for them to come into view. Then they turned around and started walking away. I listened until they were too far for me to hear. Then I gathered up everything I had and ran out to my car. I drove to the nearest gas station, which was 6 miles away, then called the police. I didn't know what was going on there, but I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. The police contacted the Airbnb host, and I was horrified to see that it was a different person than the man who had come by. They couldn't figure out who the other man was or why he was there, which is even more horrifying. I continued my road trip in the morning once the short investigation was over with, but as I was driving, there was one thing that came up in my mind that I have yet to figure out. How did the man know the lights weren't working if he wasn't the host I had texted? Maybe he had gone in and broken the lamps himself before I arrived as part of some plan to get me to trust him, or he could have been working with the host somehow. Either way, I still don't know what they were trying to do, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be around anymore if I had stayed at that cabin. Before I start the story, let me describe the setting a bit. So I was staying at a nice cottage in Ontario. This cottage was part of a small community with 12 cottages in total. They were all arranged in a semicircle around a nice park. The park had tall trees, a small playground, and a picnic area. The cottages were close to a beautiful lake where people could swim, fish, and canoe. During our stay, my older brother and I became friends with a kid named Brandon who was about 14 years old. Brandon had a habit of wandering off on his own and preferred hanging out with us rather than being with his family. As a young kid, I couldn't understand why someone wouldn't want to be close to their parents. Maybe it was because I was a bit of a goody-goody when I was younger. I always did what my parents told me, always following the rules and try stay out of trouble. And honestly, I do not like Brandon much, as he was a bit of a troublemaker. But he was a good friend of my brother. And since I looked up to my brother so much, I would follow him everywhere, even if it meant hanging out with Brandon. I wanted to do everything my brother did, because I thought he was the coolest person in the world. Eventually, Brandon got the idea to sneak out, and of course my brother tagged along. Since we shared a room, I had no choice but to join them. At first, we simply wandered over to the park and hung out there for a while, enjoying the quiet night and the cool breeze rustling through the trees. But soon we all felt bored and wanted to do something more exciting. So I suggested we call it a night and head to bed. But the older kids were the ones making decisions. Brandon proposed exploring the woods, and even though I tried to argue against it, they just ignored me. So reluctantly, we set off into the woods, with only the faint glow of Brandon's phone to guide us. Thankfully, the woods weren't too dense. You could even hear the distant hum of the highway just a few miles away. After a short walk, I wanted to go back. But I only had two choices: walk back alone in the dark, or stay with them. After a while, I realized that the woods had gone quiet. No crickets, no owls, not even a breeze. I pointed this out and we all stopped and listened. After a couple of seconds of complete silence, my brother spoke up, sounding annoyed. "Can you be quiet? I'm trying to listen." I was confused and told him I didn't make any noise. Then he mentioned the heavy breathing, comparing it to a dying pig, and told me to keep it down. Just as I was going to argue, I heard the breathing too. It was heavy and sounded difficult. I whispered, "That's not me. I can hear it too." My brother looked at me. Then the breathing got louder, as if it was getting excited. Above us, there were two lights. They glowed brightly in a brilliant blue hue, swinging gently from side to side. We were all fixated on them, unable to tear our eyes away, almost as if we were under a spell. Suddenly, a chilling moan pierced the air, sending shivers down our spines. It sounded like someone who had smoked for years, struggling to let out a scream while desperately gasping for air. And we started running. We could hear branches breaking and trees shaking behind us. Whatever it was, it seemed to be in the trees. I cannot run too fast, mostly because of my small feet, so I knew I couldn't keep it up for long. Soon pain shot through my legs, and I had to stop while my brother and Brandon kept running ahead, leaving me behind. Still, that thing, whatever it was getting closer fast. So I dove into a bush nearby. But luck wasn't on my side because it turned out to be a thorn bush. Within seconds, I was covered in cuts and scratches. I had to bite my lip to stop myself from crying out in pain. As I sat there, trying to stay quiet, I heard something heavy land on the forest floor nearby. From my hiding spot in the bush, I saw the two lights from before, shining into the small clearing where I was. But these weren't lights. They were eyes. Those eyes revealed a creature that seemed like it came from a scary dream. It was about 7 feet tall, skinny, and its skin was a dark gray color. Its arms were really long, with claws at the end. It stood there for a long time, searching around trying to find me. I stayed hidden in that bush for hours, not daring to move until I saw the sun rising fully above the horizon. Then I mustered all my strength and ran in the direction I thought the cabin was. I didn't care that I was bleeding a lot or that my clothes were torn to shreds from the thorn bush. I paid no attention to the burning sensation in my legs as I ran, pushing through the forest for what felt like an eternity. Bursting out of the trees, I stumbled onto a bustling highway. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and concerned faces. Apparently, someone had spotted me out of the woods, with torn pajamas, and called for help. When I tried to tell them what happened, no one believed me. I kept insisting, but everyone thought I was just imagining things from being in the woods too long. While I was away, my brother made it home and waited until morning to explain what happened. Then a search party had been organized before they received the call to come get me. It's been over 7 long years since those terrifying events happened, and I've spent countless hours scouring the internet, desperately searching for any information that might help me identify that mysterious creature.